Hi everyone, today we're covering cerebellum. Now, cerebellum is basically the part of the hindbrain. If you can recall, we have prosencephalon, mesencephalon, rhomencephalon. Prosencephalon has telencephalon and diencephalon. Mesencephalon is midbrain, and rhomencephalon has metencephalon and myelencephalon. Now, myelencephalon is medulla oblongata. Metencephalon is the one that has cerebellum and pons. So this is your hindbrain. What's your brainstem? So midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. This is your brainstem exclusive of your cerebellum, right? So cerebellum comes under metencephalon. Now, what's the function of cerebellum? Tone, then posture and balance, and coordination and movement. Coordination and movement, it's the most recent function. So this is the latest, most technology you could say. So this comes under the function. Oops, this comes under the function of the posterior lobe. Now you may be wondering what's the posterior lobe. So before telling you about the functions, let me familiarize you with the lobes. This is cerebellum. It has anterior lobe. It has posterior lobe, which is the largest lobe. It's also known as the middle lobe, and it has a flocculonodular, the smallest lobe. Now anterior lobe is also known as paleocerebellum. Posterior lobe is also known as, uh, before that, let me just tell you about flocculonodular. This is also known as archicerebellum. And then what are we left with? We are left with neocerebellum. So that's the latest, most newest, most is your posterior lobe, right? Neocerebellum. Now the oldest, which is flocculonodular, primitive most, archicerebellum. This was responsible for the balance. So this was responsible for balance. So whenever you talk about posture and balance, it's the function of archicerebellum, also known as flocculocerebellum, also known as flocculonodular lobe. Coordination is the latest most, so neocerebellum, the posterior lobe. Tone is of the anterior cerebellum, also known as the paleocerebellum. So this may sound confusing, but give it yourself a minute or two, you'll understand everything. Okay. Then developed paleocerebellum. What is paleocerebellum? Anterior lobe for tone. Then most latest, least recent is the neocerebellum, posterior lobe for the coordination. Now, if you look at the cerebellum from back, you will notice this is the anterior lobe, this is the posterior lobe, this is the flocculonodular lobe, this is the primary fissure, this is the uvulonodular fissure, also known as dorsolateral fissure, right? This is horizontal fissure, this is not that important, but you can see. Now, this is vermis, then there will be paravermal area, and this will be the lateral cerebellar hemispheres. Now, vermis consists of different areas, so it has lingula, central lobule. Mostly the lobules are on the lateral aspects, but this is the only lobule which is in the middle. So lingula, central lobule, then you have culmen, you have decleve, very important decleve, you have folium, then tuber, then pyramid, and very important, can you guess what this is? This is uvula. What is this? Tonsil. So do not forget uvula and tonsil. This is pyramid, right? This is lingula, central lobule, quadrangular lobule, decleve and folium, decleve and folium, right? And rest of the things you can see from here itself. Now, when you talk about cerebellum, so there is a homunculus that forms. So here you can see this is the vermis, this is the paravermal area, intermediate zone, and then you have the cerebellar hemispheres. Now, cerebellum, it controls everything ipsilateral. For example, the right side of the cerebellum controls everything on the right side. The left side of the cerebellum controls everything on the left side. This is quite the opposite of the cerebrum. Cerebrum controls motor system contralaterally. For example, the right part of the cerebrum controls the left body, right? Left half of the body. Homunculus, so it has one upright and one is the other way around. Homunculus, so this shows that the vermal area, it gives innervation to your shoulder joint, hip joint, trunk and abdomen, neck, trunk and abdomen, axial musculature. Whereas intermediate zones to the distal aspects of distal limbs, and then it has cerebellar hemispheres, right? Now moving forward, you can see outer is the gray matter, so outer gray matter, and inner would be the white matter. Now inner white matter has some nuclei of gray matter, which are known as intracerebellar nuclei or deep cerebellar nuclei. Outer is the gray matter. Now cortex is a collection of cell bodies, gray matter, and inside you have white matter. It has some deep cerebellar nuclei. Now all the fibers that are entering the cerebellum, they are excitatory. So all the input fibers are excitatory. This is something you need to know. All the input fibers are excitatory. There are two major types of input fibers. You have Mosby fibers and climbing fibers. Climbing fibers are the ones that come from inferior olive. So they are basically inferior olivary fibers, and they go all the way up to the molecular layer. and these release aspartate. Now you have mossy fibers. It comes from all the other remaining regions. For example, it could come from the cerebrum, it could come from the brainstem, from the vestibular nuclei, from the spinal cord. So those are mossy fibers, and they release glutamate, so glutaminergic, aspartate and glutamate, right? So these are climbing and mossy fibers. Now there are three major layers of the cerebellar cortex. So we're talking about the cerebellar cortex, the gray matter. I'm not talking about the white matter. White matter is here. It consists of the deep cerebellar nuclei. Easy. Now what are the layers? My personal garden. So my personal garden. So you have molecular layer, Purkinje layer and granular layer. Molecular layer consists of the basket cells. So basket is lower one and stellate is the outermost cells. Because when the stars fall, the basket has to collect them. So basket and stellate cells. Purkinje layer has flower-shaped Purkinje cells. These are of Golgi type 1 neuron. Granular layer has granular cells, but it also has Golgi cells, right? So you are now familiar with the cells as well. Now it's very important for you to know that the Purkinje cells, their axons, they go even to the molecular layer as well as to the white matter. In the white matter, they go directly to the deep cerebellar nuclei. So as the fibers they divide, there'll be primary and secondary divisions, and there'll be dendritic spines. Now these are here, and then what about the granular layer, granular cell? This gives off fibers, and this axon runs up towards the molecular layer. It gives parallel fibers. These parallel fibers interact with the basket cells, with the stellate cells, and with the Purkinje cells as well. So do not forget about the parallel fibers given by the granular cell. Then what is the other layer? So these are two important cells. So now Purkinje cells primary function is inhibition. So it's going to inhibit the deep cerebellar nuclei. What about granular cell? So its parallel fibers are going to stimulate the basket and stellate cells. So basket and stellate cells indirectly inhibit the Purkinje cells. So basket and stellate. So granular is basically indirectly inhibiting Purkinje cells. So it's going to the surrounding Purkinje cells. Why is it so? Because it wants to sharpen the signal of that individual Purkinje cell. So granular layer is going to stimulate the basket and stellate, which is going to inhibit the surrounding Purkinje cells by releasing GABA. And here you can see what is this green one. This is a climbing fiber. The climbing fiber, it goes all the way up to the molecular layer and it interacts with the Purkinje cells and it's going to stimulate it. And Purkinje cell is inhibitory in nature. It's going to inhibit the deep cerebellar nuclei and release GABA. On the other hand, mossy fibers they go up to the granular cell layer. In the granular cell layer, mossy fibers will release glutamate, and this glutamate is going to be stimulatory. It will have stimulatory effect even on Golgi cells, right? So this is something you need to know. It might sound confusing, but it's fine for now. Just try to follow along. One mossy fiber can stimulate many granular cells. So one mossy fiber will stimulate many granular cells, and granular cells gives off parallel fibers. So these parallel fibers will stimulate many basket and stellate and also inhibit many of the Purkinje cells. So what about one climbing? One climbing can only associate with one Purkinje cell. So one mossy, it associates with multiple Purkinje cells because it inhibits all the surrounding Purkinje cells. So it might have gotten a little bit confusing, but now let me tell you about the layers again, and then we'll move further. So let's just focus on the nuclei. Now for this, let's just this all is clear because we've already done this, so there's no point of reading or recapping. You can just stop and recap. There's something we need to still do, so I'm going to come there as well. Before that, we are talking about in the internal circuitry. This is what we are talking about. Now, internal circuitry. Here we are saying that the gray matter of the cerebellum comprises of a cerebral cortex and deep cerebellar nuclei. So it has outer gray matter and it has a deep cerebral nuclei embedded in white matter. White matter. Okay, so yeah. Now the cerebellar cortex is known as my personal garden. It splits into three layers from superficial to deep, molecular, Purkinje, and granular. The deep nuclei sit. Let me just turn on the highlighter. The deep cerebellar nucleus sits surrounded by white matter. Any fibers that pass into the cerebellum must synapse into it and say hello before approaching the cortex. So any of the fibers that are entering the cortex, right, or entering the cerebellum, before entering the cortex, it has to go into the white matter and say hello to these deep cerebellar nuclei. A deep cerebellar nuclei are responsible for producing the final output of the cerebellum. Very important. So who produces the final output of the cerebellum? Deep cerebellar nuclei. So are you understanding the internal circuitry? So you have different layers have different cells, and then you have two types of afferent fibers, climbing and mossy. So as these are coming and they want to go into the cortex, they have to first interact with the cerebellar nuclei, and these deep cerebellar nuclei are responsible for producing the final output of the cerebellum. The inputs of the cerebellum come from white matter tracts entering the cerebellum. These can be divided into climbing and mossy. So input comes from the white matter tracts. Climbing are like Spartans who climb olive trees. They originate from inferior olivary nucleus and thus may be called olivocerebellar fibers. So climbing fibers are known as olivocerebellar fibers. The inferior olivary nucleus itself receives inputs from elsewhere such as spinal olivary fibers. They say hello and provide collateral fibers to deep cerebellar nuclei. So obviously you have to say hello to the deep cerebellar nuclei and then climb all the way to synapse under the outermost layer of the cerebral cortex. Their main neurotransmitter of use is aspartate, that we know. Mossy fibers are like mousy mice which come from everywhere. They encompass they encompass fibers and tracts originating from all sources other than inferior nucleus, including anterior dorsal spinal cerebellar, cuneo-cerebellar, tectocerebellar, pontocerebellar, reticulocerebellar, vestibulocerebellar, and corticocerebellar fibers. They say hello and provide collateral fibers to the deep cerebral nuclei, but after that they're relatively lazy and synapse only onto the deepest layer of the cortex, which is my personal garden, so granular. The main neurotransmitter is glutamate. From above diagram, it can be seen that these groups of cells synapse into deep cerebellar nuclei. The green aspartate climbing fibers, which are stimulatory to deep nuclear cerebellar nuclei. So let's just have a look. Climbing fibers stimulatory to deep cerebellar nuclei. Then you have red glutaminergic muscle fibers, which are stimulatory to deep cerebellar nuclei. You have glutaminergic muscle fibers are glutaminergic, which are again stimulatory to deep cerebellar nuclei. So both the input fibers are excitatory in nature. The blue GABAergic Purkinje fibers, which are inhibitory to deep nuclear fibers. So you can see these are Purkinje fibers, which are here in purple color. You can see they are inhibitory to deep cerebral. So mossy fibers, the climbing fibers and mossy fibers are stimulatory, and the Purkinje fibers are inhibitory. So the three things we've covered. The Purkinje fibers are not incoming fibers to the cerebellum, but rather take origin from the Purkinje cells in the cerebellar cortex. The Purkinje fibers are not incoming fibers to the cerebellum, but rather take origin from the Purkinje cells in the cerebellar cortex. These are flash-shaped cells. Their cell bodies are located in the Purkinje layer. They extend and rise into the molecular layer. They act as synapse into the deep cerebellar layer. So the fibers also extend into the molecular layer, also into the deep cerebellar nuclei. Although the climbing and mossy fibers are directly stimulated to deep cerebellar nuclei, some of them also synapse into the Purkinje fibers and in doing so exert an indirect inhibitory effect. Important line. Each climbing fiber makes its way to the molecular layer and synapses onto a single Purkinje cell. It is fairly faithful to the Purkinje. The rest all we can cover in the next video.